When I lost the baby I was already weak. But my husband said I must have fallen on purpose. You never wanted this baby, he screamed. His mother said I was jealous of my pregnant sister-in-law. They held me down as he kicked me. I couldn't scream. I left, bleeding, in the middle of the night. 2 years later he saw me. The blood soaked through the hospital pad in less than 20 minutes. I sat on our pristine white sectional sofa, the one Ryan had insisted we buy because it would photograph well for guests, watching crimson stains spread across Italian leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Each cramp felt like my body was trying to turn itself inside out, a physical reminder that Emma was gone. Emma. We'd named her Emma Rose after Ryan's grandmother. I'd whispered that name to my swollen belly for months, promising her stories and lullabies and Saturday morning pancakes shaped like butterflies. Now she was just medical waste in some hospital disposal unit, and I was sitting here bleeding her memory onto expensive furniture. The placental abruption was catastrophic. Dr. Martinez had explained 6 hours earlier, her voice professionally gentle. There was nothing anyone could have done. Sometimes these things just happen. She'd handed me pamphlets about grief counseling and support groups, as if printed words could somehow fill the Emma-shaped hole carved out of my chest. But Ryan hadn't been listening to Dr. Martinez. He'd been pacing the hospital room like a caged animal, his jaw working silently, building toward something explosive. I should have recognized the signs. The way his hands clenched and unclenched, the muscle twitching near his left eye, the deliberate slow breathing he did when he was about to lose control. You never wanted this baby anyway. The words tore through our living room like shrapnel. I looked up from the growing blood stain, seeing my husband transform into someone I didn't recognize. His face was twisted with rage, but underneath it was something worse, relief. As if losing Emma had solved some problem he'd been wrestling with. Ryan, please. I tried to stand, but the cramping doubled me over. The hospital had sent me home with instructions to rest, to let my body heal, to take the pain medication every 4 hours. Instead, I was defending myself against accusations that made no sense. Don't you dare act innocent. His voice cracked on the last word, splitting between grief and fury. I saw how you looked when Sophia announced her pregnancy. Pure jealousy. You couldn't stand that she was glowing while you were just. Just what? The question escaped before I could stop it. Just what, Ryan? That's when Victoria appeared in our doorway like a summoned demon. Ryan's mother had her own key, of course. A boundary I'd tried to establish early in our marriage that had been steamrolled by family tradition. She must have been listening from the hallway, waiting for her cue to join the performance. She's always been jealous of Sophia, Victoria hissed, moving toward me with predatory purpose. Look what she's done now. I tried to stand again, needing to escape to the bathroom, to anywhere but this room where the air felt thick with accusation. Victoria's hands clamped down on my shoulders, pressing me back into the sofa with surprising strength for a woman in her 60s. Her manicured nails dug through my hospital gown, finding the tender spots where 4 needles had left bruises. I'm bleeding, I whispered, as if this obvious fact might penetrate their shared madness. I need to. You need to take responsibility, Victoria spat. Sophia is 8 months along and radiant. Radiant. And here you are, destroying what God gave you because you couldn't handle someone else's happiness. The cruelest part was the nursery upstairs. I'd spent 3 weeks painting it sunshine yellow because we'd wanted to be surprised. Gender neutral didn't mean colorless, I'd told Ryan, showing him paint swatches with names like Morning Glory and Buttercream. I'd hung tiny white curtains with dancing elephants and spent an entire Saturday assembling a changing table that came with 47 separate pieces and instructions written by someone who clearly hated humanity. The drawers were full of impossibly small clothes, onesies with sayings like, Daddy's Little Princess and Mommy's Miracle. I'd bought 3 packages of newborn socks because they were so tiny and perfect, each pair smaller than my thumb. There was a mobile with soft musical notes that played Brahms' lullaby, and a rocking chair where I'd planned to feed Emma in those quiet 3 a.m. moments that every mother told me I'd treasure despite the exhaustion. Ryan knew all of this. He'd helped hang the mobile, complaining about the assembly instructions but smiling when it finally worked. He'd caught me organizing the sock drawer one evening and kissed my forehead saying, "She's going to be so loved." But now, watching his face contort with blame and anger, it was as if those moments had been erased. as if wanting Emma had been some elaborate deception I'd maintained for 6 months. I painted her nursery, I said, my voice barely audible. I bought her socks. Ryan's laugh was sharp and bitter. Performance art. All of it. You were playing house until reality hit, and then you... The kick came without warning. His dress shoe, Italian leather, polished that morning for a client meeting he'd never made it to, connected with my ribs just below my left breast. The impact drove the air from my lungs and sent fire shooting through my already damaged core. I curled instinctively, protective arms wrapping around the emptiness where Emma should have been. Ryan. The scream tore from my throat, raw and desperate. But he was already reaching into his briefcase, pulling out a manila folder with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been planning this moment. Divorce papers scattered across the coffee table like oversized confetti, legal language swimming before my pain-blurred vision. I had these drawn up last month, he said, his voice eerily calm now. After I saw how you looked at Sophia's baby shower photos. I knew then what kind of person you really were. The papers landed on top of the blood spreading across the white leather. Some cosmic joke. My marriage ending in the same scarlet stain as my pregnancy. Get out. His voice was cold now, businesslike. Tonight. I can't even look at you. Victoria finally released my shoulders, stepping back as if she'd completed some necessary task. There's a suitcase in the hallway closet, she said helpfully. Take only what you came with. But I couldn't stand. Every movement sent fresh waves of cramping through my abdomen, and the bleeding had intensified. The hospital pad was useless now, overwhelmed by a flow that felt endless and wrong. I needed medical attention, needed someone to check if this was normal, needed pain medication and clean clothes, and I said get out. Ryan's voice had dropped to a whisper, which somehow felt more threatening than his shouting. I managed to grab my purse from the side table, fingers fumbling for my phone. My parents' number was the first in my recent calls. They'd been checking on me every hour since the hospital released me. But when I tried to dial, Ryan snatched the phone away. You can call them from somewhere else. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless. I leaned against the mirrored wall, watching blood seep through the back of my hospital gown and onto the expensive brass handrail. My reflection looked like something from a horror movie. Pale skin, hollow eyes, crimson stains spreading like abstract art across thin cotton. Marcus, the night security guard, was reading a paperback thriller behind his marble desk. He looked up when the elevator dinged, and I watched his face change as he took in my appearance. For a moment I thought he might help, might ask if I needed an ambulance or a phone or just a place to sit down. Instead he looked away deliberately, turning a page in his book with studied concentration. I understood. Ryan was building management's golden boy, the successful businessman who always tipped well at Christmas and never complained about noise ordinances. I was just the crazy wife having some kind of breakdown. The automatic doors whispered open, releasing me into the October night. The cold hit like a physical blow, cutting through the thin hospital gown and raising goosebumps on skin already clammy with shock. I had no shoes. They were upstairs by our bed where I'd kicked them off after returning from the hospital. The concrete sidewalk felt like ice against my bare feet. My parents' house was 12 miles away. I walked 4 blocks before a taxi finally stopped, the driver taking one look at my condition and wordlessly passing me a blanket that smelled like cigarettes and desperation. He didn't ask questions, just drove through empty streets while I bled silently in his backseat. Dawn was breaking when I finally collapsed on my parents' front porch, my finger trembling as I pressed their doorbell. The sound echoed through their quiet house like an alarm, summoning them to find their daughter broken and bleeding, still wearing a hospital gown stained with the evidence of everything I'd lost in one terrible night. The nightmares stopped on a Tuesday in March, exactly 14 months and 3 days after that horrible night. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I'd recovered those first silent weeks, and realized I'd slept through the entire night without once jerking awake in a cold sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Dr. Sarah Chin had warned me that healing wasn't linear. Some days you'll feel like you're making progress, she'd said during our first session, her voice warm but honest. Other days you'll feel like you're back at square one. That's normal. Trauma doesn't follow a schedule. Those 14 months had been a careful reconstruction of a person I'd forgotten existed. Twice weekly therapy sessions where I learned words like gaslighting and emotional abuse, Clinical terms that somehow made Ryan's behavior feel less like my fault and more like a pattern I'd been trapped in. Grief counseling, where I finally said Emma's name out loud without my voice breaking into pieces. Sleep medication that helped quiet the part of my brain that replayed Victoria's manicured nails pressing into my shoulders, over and over like a broken record. My mother had turned my old room into a craft space years ago, but she quietly moved everything out and repainted the walls a soft lavender. For peace, she'd said, though we both knew it was because I couldn't handle the color white anymore. Too many associations with blood-stained leather and sterile hospital rooms. The farmer's market had become my Saturday morning ritual, a gentle reintroduction to the world beyond therapy appointments and legal meetings. Something about the organized chaos felt manageable. Vendors calling out prices, children laughing, the sweet smell of kettle corn mixing with fresh herbs. It was life happening around me without demanding my participation. I was reaching for a bag of Honeycrisp apples when my shoulder seized, a lingering reminder of that night when Victoria had held me down. The bag was on the highest shelf just beyond my fingertips, and I felt that familiar spike of panic when my body couldn't do something simple. "Here, let me help with that." The voice was soft, careful not to startle. A man about my age, with gentle brown eyes and paint-stained fingers, reached past me to grab the apple bag. He handed it to me like it was something precious, not just 2 pounds of fruit. "Thank you," I managed, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Those are the best ones," he said, nodding toward my apples. "Sweet but with just enough tartness. Good choice." Lucas worked with his hands. I learned this slowly, over weeks of Saturday morning encounters at adjacent produce stands. He restored old furniture, bringing discarded pieces back to life with patience and skill. There was something beautiful about that concept, though I wasn't ready to examine why it appealed to me so deeply. He never pushed for more than our brief conversations about seasonal vegetables and weather patterns. Never asked for my number or suggested meeting elsewhere. Just existed in my peripheral vision, a steady presence who made the farmer's market feel safer somehow. The invitation to coffee came from me 3 months later when I finally worked up the courage. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime? Not here, I mean. Somewhere with actual chairs." His smile was sunshine breaking through clouds. "I'd like that very much." Our first coffee date lasted 4 hours. We talked about books and travel dreams and the way morning light looked different in autumn. Lucas had traveled through Southeast Asia after college, teaching English in small villages where children chased chickens through dusty streets. I told him about my job as a graphic designer, how I'd always loved creating beautiful things from nothing. He didn't ask why I seemed nervous when the barista dropped a ceramic mug, the crash echoing through the cafe like a gunshot. Didn't comment when I chose the seat facing the door, needing to see everyone who entered. Just continued our conversation about his latest restoration project, a 1920s armoire he'd found at an estate sale. The second date was at a quiet bookstore cafe, surrounded by towering shelves and the comforting smell of old pages. Lucas brought me a small succulent in a hand-painted pot. "For your windowsill," he said simply. "They're hard to kill," which I figured might be a selling point. I laughed for the first time in months. Really laughed, not the polite social sounds I'd been making. The plant sat on my bedroom windowsill for weeks, proof that something could thrive under my care. By our third date, I'd started to trust the quiet spaces between us. We were walking through Riverside Park, the same park where everything would later unravel, though I didn't know that yet. Lucas had been telling me about his childhood dog, a golden retriever named Buster who could catch frisbees like an Olympic athlete. "If you're ever ready to talk about whatever happened, I'll listen," he said suddenly, stopping beside a bench overlooking the duck pond. "If not, that's okay too." The words hung in the air like an offering. No pressure, no timeline, no expectation that I owed him my trauma in exchange for his kindness. Just an open door I could walk through whenever I felt ready. "There was a man," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "My husband. Ex-husband now. He hurt me when I was already broken." Lucas sat down on the bench, patting the space beside him. I joined him, watching ducks glide across the water like nothing terrible had ever happened in the world. "That wasn't your fault," he said quietly, and something inside my chest that had been held too tightly finally began to loosen. "None of it." 6 months later I was pregnant again. The 2 pink lines appeared on the test like an accusation, and I sank to my bathroom floor, hyperventilating. What if it happened again? What if my body was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed? What if loving this baby would just lead to more loss? Lucas found me there 20 minutes later, still clutching the plastic stick. He sat beside me on the cold tile floor, not speaking, just being present while I cried out 14 months of carefully buried terror. "We'll figure this out together," he whispered against my hair. "Whatever happens, you're not alone." The pregnancy was different from the beginning. Dr. Martinez, the same doctor who'd explained placental abruption in clinical terms, monitored me closely, scheduling extra ultrasounds and blood work. "Everything looks perfect," she said at each appointment, and slowly, cautiously I began to believe her. Lucas read to my belly every night. Children's books and poetry, sometimes just articles from National Geographic about places we'd visit someday. His voice became the soundtrack to my pregnancy, calm and steady and full of love for a baby he'd never met. When the contractions started on a snowy February morning, I wasn't afraid. Lucas held my hand through each wave, whispering encouragement and terrible jokes that made me laugh between pushes. There were no raised voices in that delivery room, no blame or anger or fear. Just anticipation and joy and the promise of something beautiful being born. Noah entered the world at 6:47 a.m., pink and perfect and screaming with healthy indignation. Lucas cried when the doctor placed him on my chest. Actual tears of happiness that he didn't try to hide or explain away. "Hello, little man," he whispered, stroking Noah's tiny fist. "We've been waiting for you." When Noah smiled for the first time, a real smile, not just gas as everyone assured me, I realized I'd forgotten what pure joy felt like. Joy without fear, without waiting for the other shoe to drop, without wondering what terrible thing would happen next. Just happiness, simple and clean and mine to keep. Noah had discovered the magic of breadcrumbs that Tuesday afternoon, his chubby fingers clutching a piece of sandwich crust like it was treasure. At 15 months, everything fascinated him. The way pigeons bobbed their heads, how shadows moved across playground equipment, the satisfying crunch of autumn leaves under his tiny sneakers. "Burr burr," he squealed, his version of birdie, as a particularly bold pigeon waddled closer to investigate his offering. I sat on the bench nearby, one eye on my son and the other on the novel I'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. Reading in stolen moments between nap times and bedtime stories. This was motherhood's secret language of interrupted thoughts and half-finished conversations. The park was busy for a Tuesday afternoon. School had just let out and older children raced past on their way to the jungle gym, backpacks bouncing. A group of moms had claimed the picnic tables near the water fountain, their coffee cups forming a protective circle around scattered goldfish crackers and juice boxes. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, the kind of ordinary afternoon that would have bored me senseless before Noah, but now felt like a small miracle. That's when I saw him. Ryan stood about 30 yards away, near the Memorial Rose Garden where couples sometimes took engagement photos. He was gesturing toward something with his left hand, and I caught the glint of a wedding band catching afternoon sunlight. The sight hit me like ice water in my veins, though I couldn't understand why. I'd known he would remarry eventually. Men like Ryan always landed on their feet. The woman beside him was everything I'd never been. Polished in that effortless way that spoke of expensive salon appointments and personal shoppers. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, not a strand out of place despite the October breeze. She wore cream-colored slacks that somehow stayed pristine around children and dirt, and her engagement ring was massive, a princess-cut diamond that threw rainbows when she moved her hand. She was laughing at something on her phone, completely absorbed in whatever TikTok or Instagram story had captured her attention. Oblivious to the fact that her fiancé had just gone statue still, his face cycling through expressions like a broken slideshow. I watched Ryan's progression of emotions with the detached fascination of someone observing a car crash in slow motion. First came shock. His mouth actually fell open, which would have been comical if my heart wasn't suddenly hammering against my ribs. Then calculation, his eyes narrowing as he processed what he was seeing. Finally, something that looked disturbingly like panic. His gaze shifted from me to Noah, who had abandoned the pigeons and was now investigating a particularly interesting stick. I could practically see the wheels turning in Ryan's head, the mathematical equation he was trying to solve. Counting months, measuring timelines, wondering if the child 15 feet away shared his DNA. Noah chose that moment to toddle toward me, stick clutched triumphantly in his fist. "Mama." "Stick," he announced as if he'd discovered fire. His eyes were Lucas's warm brown, his smile pure sunshine, his entire being radiating the kind of security that comes from being loved unconditionally since birth. I scooped him up, breathing in his sweet baby scent, graham crackers and fresh air and the lingering traces of his morning bath. "What a wonderful stick," I murmured against his soft hair, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The smart thing would have been to stay. To let Ryan see exactly how unaffected I was by his presence, how completely I'd moved on from the wreckage he'd made of my life. But smart wasn't the same as safe, and every instinct I'd developed over the past 2 years was screaming at me to leave. No. I kissed Noah's forehead, a gesture so automatic it might have been breathing, and started walking toward the parking lot. Not running, not fleeing, just a mother collecting her child and heading home for dinner and bath time. Nothing unusual about that. "Ryan, what's wrong? Who was that woman?" The fiancé's voice carried across the playground, tinged with confusion and something sharper. I didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge that I'd heard anything at all. Let him explain that. Let him try to justify why he'd reacted like he'd seen a ghost to a woman and child he supposedly didn't know. My hands shook as I buckled Noah into his car seat, muscle memory taking over while my mind raced. He babbled happily about birds and sticks, completely unaware that our peaceful afternoon had just been shattered by the appearance of a man who'd once kicked his mother while she bled. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and turn signals. Noah fell asleep before we reached our street, exhausted from his adventure. I carried him inside, settling him in his crib with the gentle efficiency of practiced motherhood, then stood in his doorway watching him sleep until my heartbeat finally slowed to something approaching normal. Lucas wouldn't be home for another hour. I made tea with hands that had finally stopped trembling, curling up on our worn sofa with the same novel I'd been attempting to read. The words blurred together, meaningless black marks on white pages, while my mind replayed every second of those terrible few minutes in the park. My phone buzzed at 8:47 p.m., just as I was closing Noah's bedroom door after his final story. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I recognized it with the sick certainty of muscle memory. Ryan's old number, the one I'd deleted 2 years ago but somehow still knew by heart. "Is that my child?" 4 words that managed to be both question and accusation, desperation wrapped in the pretense of authority. I stared at the screen until it went dark, then immediately blocked the number. But the damage was already done. Those 4 words told me everything I needed to know about Ryan's mental state, about what he'd been thinking during those long moments of calculation in the park. He'd been wondering. Maybe for months, maybe since the divorce papers were signed and he'd had time to count backwards from conception dates. Maybe since he'd seen Sophia's children and realized what he'd thrown away in a moment of rage and blame. His perfect new life suddenly had a question mark in it. The polished fiancée with her flawless hair and pristine slacks, the fresh start he'd built on the foundation of my destruction, all of it now complicated by the possibility that he'd walked away from his own child. I thought about Amanda. That was her name I'd learned from mutual acquaintances, planning her wedding to a man who'd just sent desperate text messages to his ex-wife. Choosing flowers and venues while her future husband counted months and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. Ryan had spent our entire marriage accusing me of jealousy, of being unable to handle other people's happiness. Now he was the one consumed by what-ifs, poisoned by the possibility that I'd found everything he'd thrown away. Love, family, the kind of peace that comes from being cherished instead of tolerated. I deleted the blocked message and went to check on Noah one more time. He slept with his arms flung wide, completely trusting that he was safe, that tomorrow would bring more birds and sticks and adventures. In the soft glow of his nightlight he looked exactly like Lucas. Same gentle features, same sense of quiet contentment. Ryan could wonder all he wanted. The truth was simpler than his desperate calculations. Noah was born from love, not obligation. From healing, not damage. From a man who read bedtime stories and painted nurseries and held my hand through every contraction. Some questions didn't deserve answers and some ghosts needed to stay buried. The call came on Friday morning while I was folding Noah's tiny laundry, an endless task that somehow brought me peace. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice crackled through my phone speaker, her slight accent more pronounced than I remembered. "Mija, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I think you should know. That man has been asking questions about you." I stopped mid-fold, a miniature dinosaur t-shirt clutched in my hands. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived 2 doors down from Ryan and me in our old building, a sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing and said little. She'd always been kind to me, the type who remembered your birthday and noticed when you looked tired. What kind of questions? I asked, settling into the rocking chair Lucas had bought for Noah's room. He came by Tuesday night real late. Asked Marcus if he remembered anything from that night his wife had her breakdown. Wanted to know if there were any security cameras, any witnesses to her erratic behavior. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice carried decades of skepticism. Marcus, that fool, he was ready to help until I reminded him what we actually saw. My heart started that familiar rapid-fire rhythm, but I forced my voice to stay steady. What did you tell him? Nothing. But honey, I've been keeping something for you all this time. She explained it slowly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. That night, the night Ryan kicked me out while I was bleeding, she'd been awakened by voices in the hallway. Angry voices, then crying, then the sound of the elevator opening and closing multiple times. I looked through my peephole first, you understand. Saw that mother of his in the hallway, pacing like a cat. Then I checked my Ring camera. She paused and I could hear her adjusting the phone. I saw everything, Mija. You stumbling to the elevator, asking Marcus to call your parents. The blood on your dress, the way you could barely stand. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The footage was crystal clear. A woman in obvious medical distress, not someone storming out dramatically as Ryan had apparently told everyone. The camera had captured me begging Marcus for help, had recorded the security guard's deliberate indifference, had documented every painful step I took toward those glass doors. I called 911 that night, Mrs. Rodriguez continued. Told them I thought someone was being attacked. They said they'd send a car, but by the time anyone showed up, you were gone. I filed a written statement anyway, seemed like the right thing to do. She'd saved everything. The video files, the police report number, her own handwritten account of what she'd witnessed. Something felt wrong about his story from the beginning, she said simply. A woman doesn't bleed like that from being dramatic. I found myself crying, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being believed. For 2 years I'd carried the weight of Ryan's narrative, the nagging doubt that maybe I had been unstable, maybe I had caused everything to fall apart. Mrs. Rodriguez's evidence was like finding water in a desert. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because he's getting married next month and his bride-to-be has been asking around about you. Sweet girl, seems genuinely confused about why her fiancé gets so upset when your name comes up. Figured she deserved to know the truth before she makes a mistake. Word travels fast in certain circles, especially when it involves someone as prominent as Ryan had been in our social group. Within a week of our park encounter, people were talking. Not openly, never openly, but in the careful whispers that accompany scandal. Claire called me on a Thursday evening, her voice shaking with something between guilt and relief. Ryan's sister had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over his rough edges and made excuses for his temper. She'd stayed silent during our divorce, choosing family loyalty over truth. I need to tell you something, she said without preamble. I never believed his version of what happened. We met for coffee at a small cafe downtown, far from our old neighborhood and the potential for awkward encounters. Claire looked older than her 35 years, stress lines etched around her eyes like permanent worry. I knew you wanted that baby, she said, stirring sugar into her latte with unnecessary precision. I saw how you looked at Sophia's ultrasound pictures during Christmas dinner. Pure joy, no jealousy. You asked about nursery themes and whether she was feeling the baby move yet. That's not how jealous people behave. She'd heard Ryan's version, the unstable wife who couldn't handle her sister-in-law's pregnancy, who'd somehow caused her own miscarriage through emotional instability. But Claire had also seen the nursery I'd painted, had watched me organize tiny clothes with reverent care. He was drinking more after you lost Emma, she admitted. Said he needed something to deal with the stress of your breakdown. But you weren't having a breakdown, you were grieving and he couldn't handle that it wasn't about him. Sophia reached out 2 days later, her message arriving through Instagram DM like a secret pact between conspirators. Can we talk? I owe you an apology. Sophia had always been Ryan's golden child, the sister-in-law who could do no wrong. Beautiful, successful, married to a surgeon who treated her like a queen. During my marriage, I genuinely admired her life while battling my own insecurities. We met at her office during her lunch break, a sterile conference room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and stress. Sophia was 8 months pregnant with her second child, glowing in that effortless way that had once made me feel invisible. I was scared of him too, she said quietly, her hands resting protectively over her belly. We all were. The way he'd explode over nothing, then act like we were crazy for being upset about it. His temper was always intense. She'd witnessed some of Ryan's behavior firsthand. The way he'd berate waitstaff over minor mistakes, his tendency to punish people with silent treatment when they disappointed him. But she'd also seen something else. Genuine fear in my eyes whenever he raised his voice. At Christmas, when you brought those little booties for my baby, you were so excited about your own pregnancy. There was no jealousy there, just two women sharing something beautiful. I should have spoken up during the divorce, should have told people what I actually saw. The whisper network was expanding, gaining momentum like a snowball rolling downhill. People who'd been afraid to contradict Ryan's narrative suddenly found their voices. His drinking, which had escalated dramatically after I left, became impossible to hide. Colleagues started noticing liquid lunches, missed meetings, the slight tremor in his hands during morning presentations. Amanda, his fiancée, began hearing stories that didn't align with what Ryan had told her about his unstable ex-wife. The woman who'd supposedly been jealous and vindictive didn't match the person people actually remembered. Instead, they recalled someone quiet, kind, perhaps too accommodating for her own good. Dr. Martinez, my former OB-GYN, was bound by medical privacy laws and couldn't discuss my case. But she could confirm, when Amanda asked directly, that placental abruption was indeed a medical emergency beyond anyone's control. It's not caused by emotional stress or jealousy, she said carefully. It's a random, traumatic event that happens to otherwise healthy pregnancies. Ryan's carefully constructed narrative was developing cracks, hairline fractures that threatened to bring down the entire structure. For 2 years he'd been the victim, the devoted husband whose unstable wife had fallen apart under pressure, who'd been forced to make the difficult decision to protect himself from her erratic behavior. But truth has its own gravitational pull, and lies require constant maintenance to stay airborne. With each person who spoke up, each witness who contradicted his version of events, Ryan's story became harder to defend. The irony was almost poetic. The man who'd accused me of jealousy was now consumed by it himself. Jealous of my apparent happiness, my healthy child, my ability to move forward while he remained trapped in a web of his own making. Mrs. Rodriguez's evidence sat in a manila folder on my kitchen counter, unused but comforting. I'd never needed to weaponize the truth. It was finding its own way to the surface, carried by the voices of people who'd finally found the courage to speak. Sometimes justice doesn't require courtrooms or legal battles. Sometimes it's delivered by 78-year-old neighbors with Ring doorbells and the patience to wait for the right moment to reveal what they've been protecting all along. The DUI arrest happened on a Tuesday night in April, 6 months after our encounter at the park. I learned about it through Claire, who called me with a voice full of complicated emotions, relief mixed with genuine concern for her brother's downward spiral. He hit a mailbox at 11:30 p.m., she said quietly. Blood alcohol was twice the legal limit. They found empty bottles in his car, like he'd been drinking while driving. 8 months in county jail gave Ryan plenty of time to construct a new narrative, to polish the story he'd tell Amanda when he got out. During visiting hours, he apparently painted himself as a man whose drinking problems stemmed from losing a child, not through his own cruelty, but through an unstable ex-wife who'd kept that child from him. The manipulation was masterful in its simplicity. He couldn't claim Noah was conceived during our marriage. The timeline was too obvious, too easy to disprove. But he could hint, could let Amanda draw her own conclusions about a woman so vindictive she'd deny a father access to his biological son. Amanda found me through Sophia, who'd finally grown tired of staying silent. She reached out in February, a month before Ryan's release, her message polite but determined. I know this is awkward, but I need to understand what really happened between you and Ryan. Would you be willing to meet? We sat in the same cafe where I'd met Claire months earlier, but this time I was the one with answers instead of questions. Amanda was even more beautiful in person. Porcelain skin that spoke of good genetics and expensive skincare, hair that fell in perfect waves despite the February humidity. But her eyes held something I recognized: the exhaustion that comes from trying to make sense of contradictory stories. "He told me about Noah," she said without preamble, her engagement ring catching the overhead lights as she twisted it nervously. "Said you've been keeping his son from him out of spite." I didn't cry or rage or defend myself with the desperate energy of someone wrongly accused. Instead, I opened the folder I'd brought: medical records, hospital discharge papers, birth certificates with their unmistakable timestamps. "I lost my baby the night Ryan kicked me while I was bleeding from a miscarriage," I said simply, spreading the documents across the small table like evidence in a courtroom. "Noah was born 2 years later to the man who helped me heal." Amanda studied the papers with the focused intensity of someone trained to analyze data. She was a forensic accountant, I learned later. Someone whose job required her to find truth hidden in numbers and dates. The math was simple, brutal in its clarity. Noah had been conceived 11 months after my divorce was finalized, born to a different father in a different life. "Why would he lie about this?" she asked, her voice smaller now, confused. I shrugged, gathering the papers back into their neat stack. Maybe he needed to believe he was the victim instead of the villain. She called me 3 days later, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I found text messages on his old phone," she said. "Things he sent you right after you lost the baby. Horrible things." Her voice cracked. "How did you survive being married to someone so cruel?" I told her about Lucas, about therapy, about learning that love didn't have to include fear. She listened with the intensity of someone taking notes for a test she couldn't afford to fail. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in March at Riverside Country Club, the same venue where Ryan's parents had celebrated their 25th anniversary, where I'd once attended his cousin's reception and foolishly imagined my own future celebration. Amanda had planned everything during his incarceration, creating what she thought would be his redemption story. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Sophia was. She called me that evening with a voice full of amazement and something close to admiration. "You're not going to believe what just happened." The ceremony had started normally enough. Ryan stood at the altar in his rented tuxedo, not the designer suit he'd worn to our wedding, which had been sold to pay legal fees. His groomsmen flanked him, a collection of old fraternity brothers who'd spent years enabling his worst impulses while calling it loyalty. Amanda walked down the aisle looking ethereal in vintage lace, her father beaming beside her. The guests probably thought she looked nervous. Normal wedding jitters for a bride marrying a man fresh out of jail. They had no idea she'd spent the previous week discovering the full extent of Ryan's capacity for cruelty. When Pastor Williams reached the vow portion of the ceremony, Amanda did something no one expected. Instead of reciting the traditional promises, she pulled out her phone and began reading from the screen. "You deserve to lose that baby," she read to the stunned assembly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Maybe now you'll stop being so selfish and think about someone else for once." The congregation sat frozen, unsure if this was some kind of modern ceremony they didn't understand. Ryan's face went white, then red, then white again as Amanda continued reading his own words back to him. "I should have seen the signs earlier: your jealousy, your need for attention. At least now I know what kind of person I married." Amanda's voice never wavered, professional and clear as if she were presenting financial findings to a corporate board. Victoria, resplendent in mother of the groom silver, tried to stand but seemed unable to move. The woman who'd held me down while her son kicked me couldn't meet anyone's eyes as her family's secrets spilled across the altar like blood on white leather. "These are text messages Ryan sent to his first wife," Amanda announced to the bewildered crowd. "The night she lost their baby at 6 months. While she was bleeding and grieving, he was texting her these messages." She pulled off his grandmother's engagement ring, a family heirloom that had supposedly been passed down for 3 generations, and dropped it onto the altar with a sharp ping that echoed through the suddenly silent chapel. "I cannot marry a man capable of such cruelty," she said simply, then turned and walked back down the aisle she'd just traveled as a bride. The exodus was slow and painful. Guests filed out in confused clusters, whispering among themselves, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Ryan's groomsmen looked ashamed, finally understanding what kind of man they'd been defending with their silence and complicity. Even his college roommate, who'd given the bachelor party speech about Ryan being misunderstood by people who didn't know his heart, couldn't look at him. The best man quietly removed the boutonniere from his lapel and placed it on a pew before leaving without a word. The venue coordinator, a professional woman who'd probably seen every kind of wedding disaster, later told Sophia that she'd never experienced anything quite like it. The reception hall sat empty for 3 hours. Round tables decorated with Amanda's carefully chosen centerpieces, a 4-tier cake adorned with sugar flowers that would never be cut, a dance floor that would never feel the weight of celebrating feet. Catered dinner grew cold under warming lamps while vendors waited for instructions that never came. The photographer packed up his equipment without taking a single picture of the non-existent reception. The DJ played music to an empty room until someone finally told him to stop. Ryan stood at that altar for a full 5 minutes after Amanda left, as if he couldn't quite process what had happened. His perfect redemption story had crumbled in front of everyone who mattered to him, destroyed not by my vindictiveness or jealousy, but by his own documented cruelty finally finding its way to the surface. The truth had taken its time, but it had arrived precisely when it would do the most damage to the lies he'd built his new life on. Amanda had saved herself from making the same mistake I had, but she'd also inadvertently delivered the justice I'd never sought, complete and public humiliation administered by his own words, in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. The silence that followed Ryan's wedding disaster was profound, not the tense quiet that precedes a storm, but the deep peace that settles after one has finally passed. For the first time in years, my phone didn't buzz with cryptic messages or hang-up calls. No more accidental encounters at places I used to frequent. Ryan had vanished from my world as completely as if he'd never existed. Lucas proposed on a Tuesday evening in November, while Noah napped and dinner simmered on the stove. Nothing dramatic or orchestrated, just him kneeling beside my chair at our kitchen table, holding a simple solitaire that caught the light from our pendant lamp. "I love the life we've built," he said quietly. "I love how you make coffee in the morning and sing to Noah when you think no one's listening. I love that you trust me with your fears and your dreams. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he'd finished the question, tears streaming down my face as Noah stirred in his crib down the hall, as if sensing that something beautiful was happening in our little house. We planned the wedding for the following spring, choosing my parents' backyard because it felt right. Intimate, safe, surrounded by people who'd watched me rebuild myself from the ground up. My mother and I spent weeks stringing lights through the old oak tree I'd climbed as a child, the same tree that had sheltered my childhood tea parties and teenage heartbreaks. Noah took his ring-bearer duties with the solemn intensity that only a 2.5-year-old could muster. He practiced walking slowly for weeks, clutching the tiny basket like it contained the crown jewels. On the wedding day, he made it halfway down the petal-strewn aisle before spotting a butterfly and abandoning his post to chase it through my mother's flower garden. The guests laughed, the kind of warm, affectionate laughter that celebrates life's unpredictable moments instead of judging them. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row, wearing a lavender dress she'd bought specially for the occasion. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief throughout the ceremony, whispering to my mother, "This is how it should be. This is how love looks." The same neighbors who'd once heard my screams through thin apartment walls now applauded as Lucas and I exchanged vows. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who'd brought me soup during those first terrible weeks, beamed like a proud grandmother. The mailman who'd delivered divorce papers years earlier now carried wedding invitations, the circle of my story completing itself in ways I'd never imagined. Claire came with her 4-year-old son Marcus, who immediately attached himself to Noah like they were long-lost cousins. She looked lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth about her brother had lifted some invisible weight from her shoulders. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said during the reception, watching our boys chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I was a coward." "You spoke up when it mattered," I replied, squeezing her hand. "That's what counts." She'd cut contact with Ryan after the wedding debacle, she told me. Not from anger but from exhaustion. The bone-deep tiredness that comes from enabling someone's worst impulses for decades. "He needs help," she said simply. "But I can't fix him and I can't keep pretending his behavior is normal." Sophia sent a beautiful crystal vase with an apologetic note. She couldn't attend because she was on bed rest with her 3rd pregnancy, but she wanted us to know how happy she was for my new beginning. Victoria predictably remained silent. Some people, I'd learned, would rather preserve their version of reality than acknowledge uncomfortable truths. 3 years later, I encountered Amanda in the frozen food aisle of our local grocery store. She was examining ice cream flavors with the careful attention of someone planning a special evening. The massive engagement ring was gone, replaced by a simple gold band that caught the fluorescent lighting as she reached for a pint of mint chocolate chip. "How are you?" she asked, her smile genuine and warm. There was a lightness to her that hadn't been there during our coffee meeting years earlier, a sense of someone who'd dodged a bullet and knew it. "Good," I said, gesturing to Noah, now 5 and helping me load our cart with his favorite cereal. "Really good. How about you?" She showed me photos on her phone. Her new husband, a middle school science teacher who coached Little League on weekends. Their engagement photos showed a man with kind eyes and laugh lines. Someone who looked at Amanda like she was the best surprise life had ever given him. "Thank you," she said simply, closing her phone. "You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." "You saved yourself," I told her truthfully. "I just told you the truth." She hugged me then, right there between the frozen pizzas and ice cream, 2 women who'd survived the same man in different ways. "I hope you're incredibly happy," she whispered against my ear. The strangest part about my new life was its beautiful ordinariness. No drama, no crisis management, no walking on eggshells or bracing for the next explosion. Lucas and I argued about normal things: whose turn it was to take out the garbage, whether Noah needed a haircut, where to vacation next summer. Arguments that ended with compromise instead of punishment, discussions instead of dictates. Noah called Lucas daddy without any prompting or explanation needed. To him, this was simply the natural order of things. Daddy read bedtime stories and built elaborate block towers and taught him to ride a bike in the driveway. There was no other man in our story, no complications or confusion about family structure. Mrs. Rodriguez's manila folder remained tucked in my desk drawer, evidence I'd never needed to use but found comforting nonetheless. Proof that my memories were real, that the truth had witnesses, that justice sometimes comes in unexpected forms delivered by elderly neighbors with Ring doorbells and strong moral compasses. Sometimes, usually late at night when the house was quiet and Noah was sleeping safely in his room, I wondered about Ryan. Whether he'd gotten help for his drinking, learned to take responsibility for his actions, found some measure of peace. But these thoughts were fleeting, more curiosity than concern. Mostly I didn't think about him at all. I hadn't destroyed Ryan's life. His choices had done that. The drinking, the cruelty, the refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. Amanda's public reading of his text messages hadn't created his character. It had simply revealed what was already there. I just refused to carry his shame anymore, and apparently that had been enough. My therapist had warned me that healing wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. It was about indifference. The ability to think about your abuser the way you'd think about a stranger on the bus. Briefly, without emotional investment, then not at all. I'd reached that blessed state of psychological freedom where Ryan existed in my past like any other closed chapter. The oak tree in my parents' backyard grew new leaves each spring, its branches reaching higher toward sunlight. Noah would climb it someday just as I had, learning that even the strongest trees bend in storms but rarely break. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or perfect justice. Mine ended with something better: peace and the quiet knowledge that truth has its own timeline, its own way of setting things right. If this story of quiet justice had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Amanda read Ryan's cruel text messages at the altar, exposing his true nature to everyone. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.